Okay, we're now going to discuss meaning and why is it important for us to look at meaning? Well, especially when it comes to ethical arguments. It's remarkably important for us to look at meaning because ultimately meaning makes a big difference with regards to how we discuss ethical dilemmas, ethical terms, values, conceptions of the right, things along those lines. Now, it's important also for us to study meaning because we need to try to develop better ways of understanding remarkably abstract terms. When we hear terms such as the right and the good, well, these things are really difficult for us to grasp. It's hard for us to hold on to them effectively. So we're going to have to figure out what these terms actually stand for. Additionally, we need to learn how to create definitions. Now, this is going to be remarkably important throughout the semester. When we hear concepts like justice, well, what is justice? What does this mean? What we're going to find probably throughout the semester is actually the way how we think about justice typically in ethics is not how we typically think about it in terms of our kind of legal system and so forth. We also need to understand a little bit more about rules and what rules look like. And lastly, if we understand meaning, if we have a good understanding of how meaning functions in terms of our communication, we develop better communication skills. Now, literal meaning occurs when we use grammar and conventional understandings of words to create various semantic constructs. Basically, when we create sentences, paragraphs, whatever it may be. We're going to find that literal meaning is going to be sometimes very misleading. And so we need to make certain that we have a very strong understanding of whenever language is being used figuratively or otherwise. Now, we also need to contrast that versus what we're going to call conversational implicature. That is, whenever information used for words, whenever meaning is defined by its context, as opposed to defined by its literal meaning, by its literal term. Now, whenever we're going to look at truth statements, looking at literal meaning is going to be important. Now, sometimes we're going to find that literal meaning may also need something more, maybe some technical explanation, or we're going to see terms used in very technical ways. Good writing is going to help us understand this by defining terms. Now let's take a look at a statement here. Edward's abilities must be seen to be believed. The amount of material he knows will surprise you. It would be very hard to find someone as capable as he is. He has left a deep impression on all the teachers in the department. You'll be fortunate if you can get him to work for you. Now this sounds like something we may find, say, in a recommendation letter. But when we look at the literal meaning of this, it's kind of vague. It doesn't really tell us a whole lot about who he is, what he does, his personality, things along those lines. Now, obviously, say the person actually knows Edward, knowledge. Well, based on the context of that background knowledge, this may make a lot more sense than it would to say somebody who's never met him. Now, when we look at defining terms, we need to understand the difference between a differendium and a differendium. Basically, something like a bachelor is an unmarried man. The differendium is the actual word itself. That is, the word that we're trying to come up with some idea of meaning about. An unmarried man, in this example, provides us with that. There are four basic types of definitions. Reported or lexical definitions end up looking at the existing meaning of the term. The stipulative definition assigns a new meaning to the term. The precising definition basically modifies the existing meaning to come to a more kind of technical or precise use of the language. Then a persuasive definition attaches some type of emotive, positive, or derogatory meaning to a neutral term. Many times we develop disputes verbally because we disagree about the meaning of facts. We disagree about the meaning of terms, about words. Now, these are different than factual disputes. Factual disputes are about the facts themselves. So let's say that I'm looking at, say, some economic data like jobless numbers. Well, jobless numbers, I may be able to disagree about the numbers and say that things weren't counted correctly, or maybe we're not put into the right category, or something along those lines. That's a factual dispute. Now, what it actually means, say, for example, to the overall economy, What kind of trend does it show? Things along those lines. Those disputes would be considered verbal disputes. Those are looking at the interpretation of the facts, not the actual fact itself. Now, there are a lot of ways we can resolve verbal disputes. First, we can simply agree to disagree on the usage of the term. Now, that may work in some cases, but in other cases, it's not going to get us very far. We can find common ground in definitions. We can try to figure out a new precision, perhaps, to our language. And we also could agree that different interpretations may be true. That something may be A or not A at the same time. It's going to depend on, in that case, very particular ways of viewing the situation. Now let's talk a little bit about necessary and sufficient conditions. And necessary conditions exist when it's impossible to have something without something else, a Y without an X. Therefore, if we have no X, we have no Y. An example here. It's impossible to have an A in this class without getting at least 90% of the total points in the class. In this situation, to have an A, you have to have at least 90%. If you don't have at least 90%, it's impossible to get an A. Now, if we're going to try to counter something like this, what we would do is we try to show a situation where Y exists without X. So if you could find, for example, somebody who gets an A in this class without having gotten 90% of the total points in the class, then you may be able to invalidate the statement. The sufficient condition is similar, but it's a little different. The sufficient condition is going to tell us that the presence of X guarantees the presence of Y. We can't have X without Y, and if we have X, then we do have Y, or at least it's enough for it to exist. So an example here. Being unmarried is sufficient for being a bachelor. In this situation, being unmarried is a sufficient condition for being a bachelor. We can think about other conditions which may be included within being a bachelor, and so some may be more essential than others. In this case, if being unmarried exists, it's enough to guarantee the person is indeed a bachelor. To show that X is not sufficient for Y, we're going to look for cases where X is present but Y is not. So in this situation, where we look for situations where being unmarried is not a condition for being a bachelor. Now, there are a number of ways how we could do this, but we may have to end up, for example, with this example, modifying what we mean by the term unmarried. Do we mean but never married? Do we mean divorced, widowed? Could be a question. There are four possibilities of relationships that exist between necessary and sufficient conditions. The first case, X is necessary but not sufficient for Y. An example here, Bill being a fertile man is necessary but not sufficient for fathering children. He may be fertile, but he may not be engaged in any type of sexual activity that would be sufficient for fathering children. There could be a lot of different things that Bill's doing, but his fertility may remain the same. X is sufficient but not necessary for Y. An example here, taking the bus is sufficient but not necessary. Well, there are a lot of ways how we can get from this to Little Rock. Taking the bus is definitely a way to make that happen. But it's not a necessity for it to occur. X is both necessary and sufficient for Y. So an example, winning the electoral college vote is a necessary and sufficient condition for being president. Obviously, in this situation, these things. Now, we're obviously excluding out conditions such as vice president stepping in whenever president has been assassinated or something along those lines. But we can see that this is an absolutely necessary condition for this. But it's also sufficient. Lastly, we can say that X is neither necessary nor sufficient for Y. So having good intentions is neither necessary nor sufficient for not causing harm. Well, having good intentions, if that would always get us to the point where we didn't cause harm, the world would be a little simpler. But we know that's simply not the case. Causing harm can come by from a number of different things. This leads us as well to the concept of possibility or impossibility. Now, there are several different forms of impossibility. In the first case, we could look at logical impossibility. Contradictions against the laws of logic. For example, finding a round square. We can look at causal impossibility. Whenever natural conditions may prevent something from coming about or from existing. So, for air turning to gold. Technical impossibilities simply mean we don't have the instrumental means to achieve the condition. So, for example, right now it's a technological impossibility for us to develop teleportation. We simply don't have the ability to do so. Notice that may change over time. And legal impossibilities exist when codes prevent the same thing from existing. For example, at this time, being legally married in a same-sex relationship. At least in our state at this point, it's not possible to do so. Now, there are some things that we need to watch out for when we come to meaning analysis. First, we need to make certain that we're avoiding obscurity. Now, obscurity comes about several different ways. Ambiguity comes about whenever we have terms with multiple meanings. If I refer to something as being good, but I'm using it in the term good in a vastly different way how you are, or maybe doing so, this could be problematic. Now, ambiguity can come about in two different ways. It can be referential, when the referred to thing itself is unclear, or syntactic, when the grammatical structure is unclear. Vagueness occurs whenever terms with indeterminate application or imprecise boundaries are used. And incompleteness, whenever those clarifying terms are missing or are context related, and perhaps are not spelled out. Distortion occurs when we deviate from standard meanings to produce inappropriate meanings. This may involve different forms of emotional distortion, or what we call weasel words. Weasel words are going to be things that end up creating variation or slight differences with regards to how we typically think about a term. Reification occurs when we treat an abstract as though it was concrete. And then we see categorical mistakes as well, whenever we misapply characteristics to illustrate a point. And last, we need to make certain that we're avoiding empty content. A lot of times, information is given to us that seems to provide information, but when we really get down to it, it doesn't give us anything. I love everything about you. That really doesn't tell us a whole lot. It doesn't say anything about the person. It doesn't say anything about the characteristics of the person and so forth that may engender the affection of feelings. So this phrase, which sounds nice, may be empty. We also need to make certain that we avoid tautologies. Tautology exists whenever we say that something is something because it's something. So, for example, good things are good because they're good. One of my favorite examples, the first rule of Tautology Club is the first rule of Tautology Club. Well, this doesn't really tell us anything about what the rule is or anything along those lines. We need to make certain that we're very careful when we talk about tautologies. People will say things are right because they're right, but they don't give us any reason for this.